At 65, Colonel Nathaniel Reed embodied the quiet dignity of a man shaped by decades of discipline and service. A towering figure with sharp eyes and a weathered face, he had recently retired after 30 years in the U.S. Army, where his leadership earned him respect and countless accolades. Yet despite his decorated career, Nathaniel lived a modest, solitary life. Having never married, he had devoted himself entirely to his country, and now in retirement, he often found himself seeking purpose beyond the uniform. That morning, his phone buzzed, displaying the name Mayor Jonathan Bailey. Picking it up, Nathaniel answered in his usual calm tone. "Colonel Reed," the mayor greeted warmly. "I hope you're free this evening." Nathaniel chuckled softly. "Just me and a good book, Mayor. What do you have in mind?" "My family would love to host you for dinner," Bailey explained. "We've followed your career and admire your service. It's the least we can do to thank you for everything you've done for this country." Though unused to personal invitations, Nathaniel appreciated the gesture. "Thank you, Mayor. I'd be honored." Later that day, Nathaniel selected a simple but neat navy blazer, his wardrobe reflecting his practicality. From a shelf, he retrieved a small eagle statuette, a token of courage he'd acquired years ago. Wrapping it carefully as a gift for the mayor's family, he allowed himself a brief smile of satisfaction. By 6:30 p.m., Nathaniel was on the road, driving his well-maintained but unremarkable sedan. Despite his accolades, he had never sought luxury, preferring reliability over excess. His thoughts wandered as he drove, reflecting on the years he'd spent leading soldiers through triumph and hardship. There was pride, certainly, but also the lingering weight of decisions that had forever shaped his life and the lives of others. His quiet drive was interrupted by the sudden blare of a police siren. In his rearview mirror, red and blue lights danced in the growing dusk. Frowning slightly but remaining composed, Nathaniel pulled to the side of the road and turned off the engine. His instincts told him to stay calm, just as he had during countless tense situations before. Stepping out of the patrol car was a young officer with an air of impatience. His name tag read, Officer Dylan Grant. Approaching Nathaniel's window, Grant leaned down, his posture rigid and confrontational. "License and registration," he demanded curtly, eyes scanning the vehicle. Nathaniel complied, handing over the requested documents. "Is there a problem, officer?" Grant glanced at the papers, then back at Nathaniel. "Suspicious vehicle," he said flatly, his tone carrying a subtle edge. "What's your business in this neighborhood?" Nathaniel's eyebrows raised slightly. "I'm on my way to a dinner invitation. Mayor Bailey's residence." A smirk tugged at the corners of Grant's mouth. "The mayor, huh? That's convenient. Step out of the car." Nathaniel hesitated, the unease in his gut growing. "Is there a reason for this request, officer?" "I wasn't aware I'd done anything to warrant suspicion." Grant's expression hardened, his hand resting casually on his holster. "You're being uncooperative, sir. Step out of the vehicle now." Years of military training kept Nathaniel composed. He raised his hands slightly, palms out. "With all due respect, officer, I'd like to know the reason for this stop before complying further." Grant leaned closer, his face set in a scowl. "Do you want to make this difficult? Because I can." The tension thickened, the officer's body language increasingly aggressive. Nathaniel's instincts told him this was no ordinary stop, but experience also warned him that escalating the situation would do more harm than good. "Look," Nathaniel said evenly, "I don't want trouble, but I need to understand what's happening here." Colonel Nathaniel Reed sat calmly in his car, but the growing tension was palpable. Officer Dylan Grant, standing rigidly outside, seemed determined to assert his authority. Nathaniel's decades of military service had taught him how to face pressure, but this was a new battlefield, a clash of power and prejudice. "I've already told you," Grant said sharply, his hand lingering on his belt. "Step out of the car now." Nathaniel measured his words carefully. "Officer Grant, I have not broken any laws. If you have a valid reason for stopping me, I will cooperate fully. But without that, I have every right to remain where I am." Grant's face reddened with irritation. "You think you're above the law, don't you? Driving around here like you own the place?" Nathaniel didn't flinch. "I don't think I'm above anything, officer, but I do believe in fairness. If you're stopping me because of the way I look or the car I drive, I hope you understand that's a problem. The officer's eyes narrowed, his frustration boiling over. Don't lecture me, old man. You're in my jurisdiction, and I'm the one asking the questions. For a brief moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the hum of distant traffic. Nathaniel considered his next move. Arguing further seemed futile, but his instincts told him this wasn't going to resolve on its own. He reached slowly for his phone on the passenger seat. "What are you doing?" Grant barked, stepping closer to the car. "I'm calling someone who can clear this up," Nathaniel replied evenly. "No, you're not." Grant's hand shot to his holster, and he pulled his firearm, pointing it directly at Nathaniel. "Get out of the car now, or I'll arrest you for resisting." Nathaniel's body tensed, but his expression remained calm. Raising his hand slightly to show he meant no harm, he spoke in a measured tone. "Officer Grant, you need to think very carefully about what you're doing. This is unnecessary, and it's escalating for no reason. I am unarmed, and I am not resisting." Grant's jaw tightened, the weight of the situation visibly pressing down on him, but his ego refused to relent. "Out, office, the car." Nathaniel sighed, his voice firm yet calm. "I'm calling Mayor Jonathan Bailey, who is expecting me for dinner. I suggest you holster your weapon before this situation gets worse for everyone involved." The name Mayor Bailey seemed to throw Grant off balance. For a moment, his hand wavered, though he didn't lower his weapon. "You think dropping names will save you? That won't work here." Ignoring the taunt, Nathaniel calmly dialed the mayor's number. After a few rings, the voice of Mayor Bailey came through. "Nathaniel, everything all right?" "Not exactly," Nathaniel said, his tone controlled. "I've been stopped by an officer named Dylan Grant. He has no clear reason for detaining me and is now pointing a firearm at me." There was a pause, then Bailey's voice sharpened. "Stay where you are. I'm on my way. I'll bring Chief Harrington with me." "Thank you," Nathaniel said quietly before hanging up. Grant's eyes flickered with suspicion. "Who was that?" "The mayor," Nathaniel replied evenly, meeting Grant's gaze. "He's bringing the chief of police. They'll be here soon." Grant's expression faltered, but his pride refused to let him back down. "You think you can call in favors and scare me? That's not how this works." Nathaniel didn't respond, his steady gaze unwavering. The streetlights above cast flickering shadows as the tension deepened. Minutes passed in silence until headlights appeared at the end of the road. A black SUV rolled to a stop, and from it stepped Mayor Jonathan Bailey, followed by Chief of Police Eric Harrington. Both men strode toward the scene, their faces grim. Harrington's authoritative voice cut through the tension. "Officer Grant, lower your weapon immediately." Grant hesitated, his grip tightening before finally lowering the firearm. He stepped back, his face a mixture of defiance and unease. Bailey placed a hand on Nathaniel's shoulder. "Colonel Reed, are you all right?" "I'm fine, Mayor," Nathaniel replied, "but this situation is unacceptable." Harrington turned to Grant, his tone cold. "Explain yourself. Why was your weapon drawn on an unarmed citizen?" Grant stumbled over his words. "He was acting suspicious, refusing to comply." The chief's eyes narrowed. "Suspicious? This is Colonel Nathaniel Reed, a decorated veteran of the United States Army, and you've just made a serious mistake." The weight of Harrington's words settled heavily in the air. Grant looked down, the reality of his actions finally dawning on him. The air felt heavy as Chief Eric Harrington stepped closer to Officer Dylan Grant, his face a mask of restrained anger. Mayor Jonathan Bailey stood beside Colonel Nathaniel Reed, his expression equally stern. The street, illuminated by the flicker of police car lights, had grown eerily quiet. "Officer Grant," Harrington began, his voice cold and measured, "I need a full explanation." "Now." Grant, still visibly shaken, straightened his posture and attempted to recover. "Sir, I stopped this vehicle because it seemed out of place in this neighborhood. When the driver refused to step out, I had to ensure my safety." "By drawing your weapon on an unarmed man?" Harrington interjected, his tone sharpening. "This isn't ensuring safety. This is a reckless abuse of power. And your justification, out of place in this neighborhood, sounds a lot like profiling to me." Grant's mouth opened, but no words came out. He cast a nervous glance at Nathaniel, who stood tall and silent, his calm demeanor contrasting starkly with the officer's unease. Bailey turned to Nathaniel. his voice filled with concern. "Colonel Reed, I'm deeply sorry this happened. Are you all right?" Nathaniel nodded. "I've faced worse, but this is unacceptable. It's not about me, Mayor. This is about a system that allows someone like Officer Grant to feel entitled to act this way." Harrington gestured to a nearby officer who had arrived as backup. "Take Grant's weapon and escort him back to the station. He's suspended effective immediately, pending an internal investigation." "What?" Grant's voice rose in disbelief. "Chief, I was just doing my job." "No," Harrington snapped, his voice like thunder. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to intimidate and profile. You've failed the badge tonight, Grant. Now go." Reluctantly, Grant handed over his firearm, his hands trembling. As he was escorted to the patrol car, he cast a final glance at Nathaniel, a mix of resentment and regret in his eyes. With Grant removed from the scene, Harrington turned back to Nathaniel. "Colonel Reed, I owe you an apology on behalf of this department. This behavior is not what we stand for, and it will not go unaddressed." Nathaniel met the chief's gaze. "Thank you, Chief Harrington. I appreciate your swift action. But you and I both know this isn't just about one officer. It's a systemic issue that needs fixing." Bailey nodded solemnly. "Nathaniel's right. We've seen incidents like this far too often, and it's clear we need to do more to ensure our officers are held to the highest standards of professionalism and respect." Nathaniel spoke, his tone calm but firm. "I've spent my life defending this country, believing in the principles of justice and equality. Yet tonight, I was treated as if I didn't belong in the very nation I served. That has to change. Not just for me, but for everyone who faces this kind of treatment without the privilege of being able to call the mayor." Harrington listened intently, the weight of Nathaniel's words pressing heavily on him. "You're absolutely right, Colonel. I'll ensure this investigation is thorough, and I'll personally lead reforms to address these issues in our department." Bailey placed a hand on Nathaniel's shoulder. "We'll start by making this right, Nathaniel, but we'll need your voice in this process. People need to hear your story." Nathaniel hesitated. "This isn't about me, Mayor. It's about ensuring no one else has to endure what I did tonight." Bailey smiled faintly. "That's exactly why your voice matters." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another black SUV. From it emerged a team of investigators sent by Harrington to begin documenting the incident. One of them, a young officer with a respectful demeanor, approached Nathaniel. "Colonel Reed, if you're willing, we'd like to take your statement back at the station. It'll help us piece together a full report." Nathaniel glanced at Bailey and Harrington, then back at the officer. "I'll cooperate, but on one condition. This investigation doesn't just end with paperwork. It needs to lead to real change." The officer nodded. "Understood, sir." As Nathaniel climbed into the mayor's SUV to head to the station, he cast a final look at the now empty street where the confrontation had occurred. In his heart, he felt the familiar resolve he'd carried through decades of military service, a determination to fight for what was right. The video of the encounter went viral overnight. A bystander had recorded Officer Dylan Grant pointing his weapon at Colonel Nathaniel Reed and uploaded it to social media. Within hours, the footage spread across platforms, drawing millions of views and sparking a firestorm of outrage. The caption read, "Veteran threatened by police for driving while black." News outlets picked up the story, and by morning, it was the lead on every major channel. Commentators expressed disbelief that a decorated veteran, someone who had dedicated his life to protecting the nation, could be subjected to such treatment. Hashtags like #Justice for Reed and #End Racial Profiling trended nationwide. At the center of it all, Nathaniel Reed sat quietly in his modest home, scrolling through messages of support on his phone. Former soldiers he had commanded, community leaders, and even strangers reached out to thank him for his calm and dignified response. Yet the colonel found no joy in the attention. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Mayor Jonathan Bailey and Police Chief Eric Harrington stood on the porch. "Nathaniel," Bailey began, his expression earnest, "we need to talk. May we come in?" Nathaniel nodded, stepping aside to let them in. The three men settled in the small living room, the weight of the situation evident in their silence. "First," Harrington said, his voice firm, "I want to assure you that the investigation is moving forward. Officer Grant has been suspended, and we're working to determine whether criminal charges are appropriate." But we need your help. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. My help? Bailey leaned forward. You've become the face of something much bigger than just this incident, Nathaniel. People are listening. They see you as a symbol of what's wrong and what needs to change. Nathaniel sighed, setting his phone down. I didn't ask for that. I didn't want this to become about me. Harrington nodded. I understand, but your voice has power. If you're willing, we'd like you to join us at a press conference tomorrow. Not just to tell your story, but to help us outline the changes we're planning to make. What kind of changes? Nathaniel asked, his tone skeptical. Harrington straightened in his seat. We're implementing mandatory training on racial bias and de-escalation tactics for all officers. We're also establishing an independent civilian oversight board to review complaints against law enforcement. Bailey added, This isn't just about damage control, Nathaniel. It's about rebuilding trust between the community and the police. We need to show people that we're serious about change. Nathaniel considered their words carefully. I'll do it, he said finally, but only if this isn't just lip service. I've seen too much of that in my time. Bailey placed a hand on Nathaniel's shoulder. You have my word. The next day, the press conference drew a massive crowd. Cameras flashed and reporters jostled for position as Nathaniel, Bailey, and Harrington stepped onto the stage. Bailey spoke first, addressing the incident and pledging a commitment to accountability. Harrington followed, outlining the reforms his department would implement. Finally, Nathaniel approached the podium. The room fell silent as he looked out over the crowd. For more than 30 years, I served this country, believing in its ideals of freedom and equality, he began, his voice steady. Last night, I was reminded that those ideals remain unfulfilled for too many of us. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. This isn't just about me. It's about every person who has been judged unfairly, treated as less than, or made to feel like they don't belong. We can do better. We must do better. And it starts here, with accountability and real change. The room erupted in applause. Many stood, clapping not just for Nathaniel's words, but for the strength and grace he had shown throughout the ordeal. Over the next week, the fallout continued. Officer Grant resigned from the force before he could be officially dismissed. His name became a symbol of the kind of behavior that needed to be eradicated. Protests demanding systemic reforms spread beyond the city, with civil rights organizations seizing the moment to push for broader change. At the same time, Harrington began implementing the promised reforms. Officers attended training sessions on racial bias and conflict resolution, while the new Civilian Oversight Board held its first meeting. Though progress was slow, it was tangible, a small but significant step forward. Nathaniel stayed out of the spotlight, returning to his quiet routine. But his impact was undeniable. Letters of gratitude poured in, and organizations invited him to speak at events advocating for justice and equality. He accepted only a few, always reminding audiences that his story was just one among many. This isn't about me, he told them. It's about all of us standing together to build a better future. Months passed, but the ripple effects of the incident continued to shape the city and beyond. Colonel Nathaniel Reed became a reluctant but respected symbol of justice and reform. Though he hadn't sought the spotlight, his name now carried a weight that sparked meaningful conversations across the nation. In the days following the press conference, Nathaniel kept a low profile. He spent his mornings walking the quiet trails near his home, finding solace in nature. The stillness gave him space to reflect on the events that had unfolded. He thought about the people who didn't have the means or connections to defend themselves, the ones whose voices were drowned out by the system. One crisp morning, his phone rang. It was Mayor Jonathan Bailey. Nathaniel, Bailey began, his tone warm. I know you've been taking some time for yourself, but I wanted to thank you again. Your actions have changed the city. You've made us better. Nathaniel chuckled softly. I think you're giving me too much credit, Jonathan. The work's just beginning. Well, Bailey continued, I thought you'd like to know. Chief Harrington's reforms are already making an impact. The Civilian Oversight Board has received its first round of complaints, and officers are attending their second week of racial bias training. It's not perfect, but it's progress. Nathaniel nodded to himself. Progress is good, Jonathan, but remember, it's a marathon, not a sprint. People will be watching to see if the changes stick. They will, Bailey assured him. We'll make sure of it. Meanwhile, Officer Dylan Grant had become a shadow of his former self. After resigning from the police force, he faced public condemnation and personal isolation. For weeks, he avoided the news, unable to bear the sight of his name plastered across headlines. One evening, sitting in the dim light of his small apartment, Grant finally confronted the reality of his actions. The arrogance he once carried had crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny. In its place was a nagging question: how did I get here? Determined to understand, Grant began attending community forums and discussions on policing and racial equity. He avoided the spotlight, sitting quietly in the back of rooms where people shared their stories of pain and perseverance. Slowly, he began to grasp the depth of the harm he had caused, not just to Nathaniel, but to the community he had sworn to protect. Though redemption wouldn't come easily, Grant resolved to educate himself and contribute to positive change in whatever way he could. One afternoon, Nathaniel received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the return address caught his attention. It was from Dylan Grant. "Dear Colonel Reed, I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not writing to excuse my actions. What I did that night was wrong, and there's no justification for it. I want you to know I've spent the past months trying to understand the harm I caused, both to you and to the values I was supposed to uphold. You didn't deserve what happened to you, and I didn't deserve the badge I wore. I'm working to be better, but I'll carry the weight of my actions for the rest of my life. Thank you for your patience and grace that night. It taught me more than I ever learned in my years on the force. Sincerely, Dylan Grant." Nathaniel read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. He didn't know if Grant's words would lead to real change, but he appreciated the acknowledgement. In the months that followed, Nathaniel continued to quietly advocate for reform. He met with community leaders, spoke at events, and consulted with law enforcement officials on how to rebuild trust. His steady presence inspired others, not because he sought recognition, but because he exemplified the power of resilience and humility. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Nathaniel allowed himself a rare moment of pride. The road ahead was still long, but he knew that change had begun.